people, for naming us as your salt and light for the world. May your word and our time together strengthen us. Strengthen us for your purposes so that we can be those transforming ingredients in the world. May the meditations of our hearts and the words of our lips always be pleasing to you, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. How many remember that October snowstorm? If you don't remember it, it's because you probably were here and you were very fortunate not to have lived through that storm that we cannot forget. Remember that storm? It came by real surprise. School was closed for a number of days. Some of us were without power for 5 days. Some of us were without power for up to 10 days. We'll never forget that October storm. It turned our lives completely upside down. We were quite shocked. I remember the first 48 hours where it was kind of interesting that we didn't have power. It was a little bit of a novelty. It was irritating, of course, not to have the conveniences, but after 48 hours, it really got to be tiresome, didn't it? Many of us just wondered if we should just pack up and leave town for a while, and some did. We're fortunate enough to be able to go to a relative or a family member not too far away that did have power. But there were lessons learned. We learned how it could be to live without electricity. We learned how it could be to live without heat, even as the temperatures were quite low, even at the end of October. We learned, and some of us learned, that what it was like to not even have running water because there was no electricity to service our wells. All of us have stories to tell. It's an experience that we will not forget if we were here to live through it. I remember myself having to pull out the old Coleman camp stove and to put it out on the porch and open up all the windows so that we could heat up some food and have enough hot water to do a little bit of bathing. Really making way to live for whatever time it was going to take until the lights were back on. And as I said, the first few days were interesting, but after 48 hours of no power, I was no longer interested in a cold house and long nights without electricity. And quickly my family abandoned me for places where there was electricity. Since the October storm, we know that the state and the utility companies have been working together to find ways to make changes so that if this type of weather comes upon us again, we won't repeat that experience. Because living without heat and living without electricity is something we might remember in the past and can smile about it today, but we don't want to repeat it, do we? We don't like it when the lights go out, right? We don't like it when the power goes out, even for the briefest moment. I remember living without electricity for over 3 years. And many of you, too, live without electricity back in Ghana and other places in the world. And after a while, I got used to not reaching for the wall and flipping a switch. I got used to not having anything that would plug into the wall. So when the sun went down, out came the kerosene lamp, the candles, the flashlight, everything that I needed to give me a little bit of light in my little tiny house. When the sun went down, things changed very quickly. And that's how life was. It was simply unplugged. Folks in the village that I lived in South America and Paraguay wondered out loud a lot, when would electricity come to them? When would they be able to flip a switch and have at least one light bulb or 2 light bulbs in their house? They always waited for that news to come. Because electricity wasn't too far away, and the strange thing was that huge power lines went through the village I was living in. They were coming from a distant place, but there was no electricity in the village that we were living in. I moved out of that village after 2 years and into another village, and the word came while I was there that electricity would be coming soon. Now, down in South America, when someone says electricity is coming soon, it could be 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years. But people got really excited. They called in the electricians. They put all the utility connections into the house that you could go into someone's house and see light bulbs screwed in, but there was no electricity. The lights were still out. There was lots of funds raised to pay for the palm trees that would be the poles that would hold up the lines. Everybody was excited because they knew when electricity came, it would change their lives. All the different things that they could use, they could plug in, whether it was a refrigerator or a fan or simple light bulbs. They knew their life would be changed. And yes, when lights go out or are installed for the first time, something very different happens. The individual attitudes of the family members as well as the community, when lights and electricity come or go out, people change. The power of electricity, the power of light is amazing in how we live our lives and how we behave. You know, in places when the power goes out and communities are under stress, we see those in great need or those that are just have bad ideas in their hearts and minds just go about taking advantage of no power there. They become different individuals. They're breaking windows, looting, carrying on. Whereas others, they find themselves gathering around and making sure that they take care of their neighbors in need. When I think about the power going out, I remember the storm that came to New York City. Remember that? That hurricane. It was a marathon weekend in New York City, and that storm came, that hurricane came, and a city that is known for never going to sleep, always awake, because the lights are always on. People are always on the streets in New York City, as you know. But as soon as that storm came and knocked out power in many sections of the city, everything changed radically. It really became a sleepy town. There were fewer people, if any people, on the streets, and everybody was trying to figure out how to live their lives in a different way because the lights went out. You know, Jesus communicated to his disciples. And I would say he communicated not only to his disciples, but he communicated to those uncommitted folks that were curious about what he was saying and doing. He communicated to them that if you were going to join up with him, and this is not just those ancient ancestors of long ago, but imagine him speaking to us today. He said, if you're going to join up with me today, you need to understand that you're going to have a different life. And that your life is going to be powered up with a purpose. Powered up with a purpose. Purpose that I'm going to show you. And a purpose that I'm going to help you understand for yourself. A life committed to following Jesus means a life committed to transformation. That's the purpose, right? You're getting powered up for change, for transformation. You're getting powered up if you're going to follow Jesus to make a change in oneself. And that's a lifetime task. We're always working on ourselves as Christians, trying to find a better way to draw ourselves closer and closer to God and to one another. And we're also assigned the task of powering ourselves up for change, for transformation, so that we can go into the world as ourselves, trying to make these changes that we know the world so desperately needs. Whether it's locally or globally, being that powered up source of transformation. Jesus tells us that getting behind him is going to mean doing a lot of hard work here on earth. It's not easy. We know that. We talk about that a lot. That the task of being a disciple demands hard work. We can't just drain the power and expect the power to simply be the source for our change or the change of the world. We have to take that power in as a plant takes the sunlight in and transform it within ourselves and use it to strengthen us and direct us and guide us so that we can produce those fruits of change. It means living that upside down, powered up life that reaches deep into places where sorrow, pain, hunger, violence, guilt, and distress can be found. That's the hard work because, see, if you're going to get behind Jesus and you're going to walk with Him, alongside Him, behind Him, if you're going to power up for transformation, it means you have to go where change is so desperately needed, near and far. And the Beatitudes lay that out for us. Jesus talks about where need is so great is where those neighbors of yours are in grief. Where need is so great are where your neighbors or even family members are hungry or without clothes or finding themselves not at peace or struggling in some way. It's a hard place to go. And so we have to be powered up and ready for that task of going to where we might rather stay away from. Jesus made it very clear to His followers and curious onlookers, if you want to follow me, He also said, not only in His own words, of course, in the gospel text, to power up, He said, get ready to be in trouble, because the Beatitudes remind us that if you do decide to get alongside and behind Jesus, you're going to find yourself in trouble like the prophets that came before you. Hard places to be. Trouble that might come your way. You can see why Jesus would use these images of life-changing ingredients like salt and light to get folks to understand that you have to carry yourself into the world in a way that will allow you to be that source of change. The words of Jesus in many, many different ways bring discipleship life into focus. He was constantly trying to give His listeners and followers a clear understanding so they could make a clear choice for themselves on what it would mean to pick up your cross, to walk in my path, to follow me. And so in this morning's gospel text, Jesus speaks about the simple ingredient, the mineral salt. He talks about light. He talks about being salt of the earth. He talks about being light of the world. You see, it's not just being a salty ingredient for oneself or light for oneself so that you can see or taste in your own experience. It's for the earth. It's for the world. It's to be part of creation. It's to be part of the global gift that God has given us in life. Yes, salt adds and enhances flavor. And yes, light transforms time and space. And Jesus calls His followers to be both. Yes, Jesus brings into clear focus what it means to be a follower. Disciples of Jesus, and I keep saying this over and over again, are called to transform the life experience of themselves and others. And what's important to know about this text is what Jesus is saying about salt and light. He's not speaking to us just as individuals. Remember, Matthew was written, of course, when there was a time of gathering of Christians. They were starting to form those early churches. So Jesus' words were shaped in a way and put into the gospel text to influence larger groups of people. And so you can try to close your eyes and imagine that the early church leaders, the earliest church leaders standing up and saying, I remember when Jesus said, you are the salt of the earth and you are the light of the world. And now He's saying that to us through these written words that we, the people that call themselves the church, have to be these ingredients of change. It's not about solo work, it's about cooperative work. When the lights go out, one person can flip on a flashlight or light one candle or one lantern. But that city on the hill, when the lights go out, all these lights get lit together. And they're put up on the walls around the city, and all of a sudden that whole city becomes aglow because many powered up and lit their lanterns. The same thing with salt. You put one tiny grain of salt on your eggs or your pizza or whatever you like it on, your popcorn, your pretzel, you're not going to really taste a lot. But when you put lots of salt on that meal, maybe too much, be careful, you really have the flavor enhanced. And that's what Jesus is saying. Don't be a single grain of salt. collect yourself with other grains of salt so that you can be that transforming, life-enhancing force in the world. Sisters and brothers in Christ, the church followers of Jesus have not always been the salt of the earth or the light of the world. The message is clear. Jesus makes it crystal clear for all of us what we're supposed to be, but we're not always faithful to the words that we hear come to us from the gospel text. We must take note that we're not blameless in our collective or individual actions as disciples of Christ. We benefit, of course, day in and day out from the grace of God that gives us that forgiving love so we can go forward and reflect on what we should have done and ought have done. But we don't give up on the task because we fail or fall off the path. We just jump back on and say, all right, I'm back on path. I want to power up. I want to be that transforming force. But we have to take note that we can learn from failure. I want you to listen to the words of a disappointed Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Famous words. Maybe some of the students have studied Dr. King's letter from Birmingham jail. It is an amazing letter. He put a lot of thought into that letter before he was even locked up in that jail cell in Birmingham, Alabama. He had something to say to his colleagues, his white colleagues in Birmingham, Alabama. He was saddened and disappointed in their reaction to the movement to bring social and racial and economic justice to urban areas and throughout the United States. And so I want to read you just these tiny little paragraphs that will give you a sense of Dr. King's disappointment as well as his hope, because there was not this salt and this light being put into the world. And so I quote, "There was a time," says Dr. King, "when the church was very powerful. In the time when the early Christians rejoiced at being deemed worthy to suffer for what they believed." Dr. King's looking way back in the church history here. There was a time when the church was very powerful, and I add the time when the church was that bold taste of salt and that bright light into the world. There was a time, says Dr. King, and then I go on to read his words. In those days, the church was not merely a thermometer that recorded the ideas and principles of popular opinion. Dr. King says, and listen to this, the church was a thermostat that transformed the mores of society. Difference. Do you want to be a thermometer that measures, or you want to be a thermostat that controls? And I don't say control in a negative sense, a control that is transforming that light and salt force that we're powered up to be. And then Dr. King goes on to say, things are different now. Things are different now, says Dr. King in his letter to his colleagues, written from Birmingham. So often the contemporary church is a weak and ineffectual voice with an uncertain sound. Ouch. And then King writes, so often it is the arch defender of the status quo, far from being disturbed by the presence of the church. The power structure of the average community is consoled by the church's silence. An often vocal sanction of things as they are. Dr. King was saying, you're not being the salt of the earth. You're not being the light of the world if you just stand and allow the status quo to be the way it's going to be. Dr. King, as discouraged as he was at that time, did offer hope for a church within a church. His prayer was that folks would rise up in all churches, white, black, of whatever ethnic history or lineage. That there be a church within the church that would be that salt, that would be that light. And he even says, and I quote, the spiritual salt that has preserved the true meaning of the gospel in these troubled times. That's what he prayed for and hoped that the church would be, that spiritual salt that would preserve the integrity and the power of the gospel in these troubled times. You know, friends, it's no different for us in terms of the call to be that spiritual salt, or to be that light of the world. Yes, matters and issues have changed around racial injustice and social injustice, but there's still things happening that divide God's people and deny God's people the fullness of life. There are still issues to be handled. There's still work to be done. Not all is the beloved community. Have we reached that point? And I would say no. Dr. King loved the church so much, and he was not ready to give up on the vessels, we being those vessels that hold the potential of being the transforming power of God. The vessels that could be powered up, that could be the salt of the earth, that could be light of the world. It means being a body of believers who were equipped to bring light into the shadows of racial and economic justice. Dr. King was not willing to give up. As hard as it became for him, he believed with all his heart and mind. We can tell from his writings that there was a place for the church. It just had to be honest and true to the purpose that God had established for it. Sisters and brothers in Christ, we are still in troubled times, as I said. Our times are not the same years of social strife during the civil rights movement, but there still is much to be done to bring Dr. King's belief in the beloved community into reality. There is much for the church to do to be the spiritual salt that preserves the true meaning of the gospel. We have to go back to that all the time and ask ourselves, are we meeting the test of being true to the gospel when we serve and we act and when we meet and decide how we're going to spend our resources? And I may add, and maybe we dare to add, that there is much more for the church to do to be the spiritual light that reflects the true meaning of the gospel. Friends, when we think about our life together and our responsibility locally and globally, we've got to say to ourselves, we cannot let the lights go out. We cannot let the lights go out within this building. We must not let the light of Christ go out within our hearts or in our minds. We can't let that go. We must not let it go out of the church. We must be powered up to be Christ in the world. The sadness is that many churches are worried about actually keeping the lights on. And everything becomes the focus of how are we going to do this? How are we going to make sure the lights and the heat are on? And all of a sudden, powered up literally for keeping the power on instead of being powered up for getting the ministry of Jesus Christ out into the streets and into the world. Many of us are so inspired by those that are doing the work of Christ in so many places of the world where there is no power. There is no church building. They're completely out into the world, and I think that's what Jesus wanted us to be, that salt and light out into the world. That's why he used earth and world in those texts to be those transforming ingredients. Sisters and brothers in Christ, there is so much at risk if we're not. You can tell by our communities locally here. Churches and all faith communities are critical institutions in our cities and towns. We represent light and hope and transforming possibilities and opportunities for lives. Churches have a long history of reflecting God's call for love and action. And sure, we may not always get it right, but failure is not an excuse for faithlessness. We have been called to be the light and the salt. And if we try something and it doesn't work, it doesn't mean we stop. It means we learn from that failure and we go ahead with some new ideas and new possibilities. Because at the heart of who we are is a vessel that's been powered up for God's purposes. For we are resurrection people fueled by hope and with the power of grace. The lights, my friends, have gone out in too many churches in New England, of all denominations, leaving communities and neighborhoods at a loss. Every time a church or a religious institution or a social institution closes, the fabric of this community is torn, it's frayed. Where do people go in that neighborhood to join together, to be in relationship with one another? Where do they go for help or to just be with other people to combat loneliness? Where do you go when you have a great idea about contributing something to your neighborhood? If there's no church, if there's no place to go, if the lights are out, all suffer. So brothers and sisters, as followers of Jesus, we all have a shared responsibility to be the salt and the light. And we also have the individual responsibility to make sure that we are those vessels that can hold that salt and contain that light. Because at the end of the day, the question for us is, how are you reflecting God's love into the world? So my prayer is always, as we prepare to go into the world, is that we will be Christ in the world. We'll find a way to reflect that light in some way. You don't have to be a spotlight. All you have to be is a pin light. You don't have to be a box of salt. All you have to do is be a few grains. But you have the power. You have the flavor to be that transforming ingredient. Go out into the world. Don't be afraid to add a little salt, to flash a little light. Don't be afraid to make a difference. Be Christ in the world. Amen. Amen. Let us continue our worship together.